OK, let's take a look at some of the main stories in the headlines today. Let's speak to Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin, and also Noah Khogali, a political commentator. Good afternoon to you both.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Professor Scott Lucas, let's start with you. Could we be getting closer to a deal, an agreement, when it comes to the Northern Ireland Protocol?
That really turns upon how deep the divisions are within the Conservative Party. It turns upon how much Boris Johnson wants to use this to become Prime Minister again by sabotaging the government. And it turns upon whether the government is also hostage to the DUP in Northern Ireland. So there's a lot of what-ifs here. I think it's quite clear that the negotiations between the EU and the UK, which have been necessary because of the economic damage of Brexit and because of the risk to stability on the Irish island, they're close to an agreement to at least mitigate that damage. But no, there's certain interests who are there partly because of political expediency, that's Mr. Johnson, partly just because of an ideological antipathy to anything which can be done to maintain the protocol, who will try to undermine it. So it's a what-if situation, and it really comes down to, will Rishi Sunak risk the possibility that part of his party will split off? And is he a strong enough leader to take on that risk?
Yeah, that's interesting because earlier this week, actually, I think on Wednesday, Sir Keir Starmer, Labour leader, said, hey, if you're not going to get enough support from your people, Rishi, we'll back it. We'll back what you're going to do. But yes, going into the weekend, a number 10 source has described negotiations as positive. Noah, do you think we could be getting close to some kind of deal here?
Absolutely, we might be. And I think the comment about Rishi Sunak's strength really does hit this on the head. He doesn't actually need the DUP anymore, and he doesn't actually technically need the ERG anymore, now that Keir Starmer has put his votes on the table, essentially. So the reality here is Rishi Sunak going to take the risk of trying to get this problem, which has plagued basically every politician since 2016, off the table and finished, done and dusted? Is he going to take that risk of upsetting those people within his own party? Something that's really interesting here, though, is the fact that somebody like Steve Baker still seems to be on board. One would have to assume that he knows what's going on, and as kind of the bully man Brexiteer image, he's still part of the government. He doesn't appear to be making any sounds about being unhappy. So one would hope that means something's coming down the line that is potentially going to be good for everybody.
Absolutely. Well, let's see. It's been a long and arduous road to this point, but yes, indeed, if we could just get over this, make that deal when it comes to Northern Ireland Protocol, and just continue on with Brexit, I think there'll be many people very, very pleased with that. Professor Scott, let's talk Ukraine, shall we? Just a really, really bleak anniversary this week, a year since Russia invaded Ukraine, and now just yesterday, China have stepped in with their peace plan.
Well, it is bleak in a sense of remembering that Vladimir Putin's war, and it is Vladimir Putin's war to try to break Ukraine, has cost so many lives, not just the troops who have defended Ukraine, but tens of thousands of civilians in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of children who have either been deported or at risk of deportation, millions of Ukrainians who've had to leave their homes. But in that bleakness, there is the resilience of the Ukrainian people, the resilience of their government and their military, because remember, or at least for me, speaking to analysts on the night that Russia invaded, we thought Kyiv would fall in a few days. We thought that at best Vladimir Zelensky would have to flee to avoid being captured, killed by the Russians. That didn't happen. So in that resilience of Ukraine, and in the willingness of the international community, perhaps belatedly, but the willingness of the international community to provide financial support and military support to Ukraine, not only have the Russians been checked, they've been forced to withdraw from much of Ukraine, and we have the prospect that if the support for Ukraine continues, that Ukraine can liberate much of its country during this next year. As far as the China plan comes on board, the Chinese are trying to take a ground where they become like the broker of negotiations. I'm not sure that their plan really is as effective, as salient as Vladimir Zelensky's 10-point plan is. But here's the significant thing, Claudia-Liza. A lot of people kept saying, oh, China's going to back Russia militarily. China's going to back Russia with weapons, with lethal aid. I think this is a sign that the Chinese know that going all in with Vladimir Putin is not the way to play this. Doesn't mean there won't be tensions with Beijing, but it does mean I think there's an opening there to at least keep them, as it were, away from Moscow, a bit distanced from Moscow, as we try to get Ukrainian liberation in 2023.
That's true, but also saying that you're right. We haven't actually seen those weapons we were worried that China would provide to Russia. But even in that 12-point plan, that 12-point document, it speaks of calling for Ukraine and Russia to sit down for peace talks. But in that same plan, speaks of a state, a nation's right to defend itself. Very much what Vladimir Putin says he's doing while invading Ukraine. What do you make of this, Noah? Do you think this is a genuine effort from China to try and bring peace to Ukraine?
I wouldn't take very much that the CCP do at face value, to be honest. I think especially when it comes to things like this, you need to look at the larger geopolitical issue. And I think China are probably trying to treat this as a dry run, so to speak, for Taiwan, and see whether the West has the bottle to really be steadfast on an issue like this. China aren't coming in here to be saintly. They're coming in here to start seeing whether they can see if there's any cracks in terms of the resilience of the West, especially after much of this has had an incredibly tough winter, especially in regards to something like fuel. That could be massively, massively bigger if China invaded Taiwan when it comes to something like chips. And this is really, really an important moment. And the West has to make sure that it doesn't give an inch and then that turns into a mile when China inevitably makes moves on its own borders. And we've got to be really, really aware of what the larger picture looks like here. This is not just about Ukraine anymore. This is about how the West responds to expansionist, authoritarian, and often genocidal regimes internationally.
Scott, do you think there could be any signs of a peace talk between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin? Only because Zelensky is also quite firm in that not only does he want to reclaim any territory lost in this Ukraine war, but actually he wants to go further. He wants to go to territory lost in 2014. And I'm not sure about you, but that seems something that's incredibly unlikely.
I'm afraid you have to ask Mr. Putin, because he's the biggest barrier to any type of political discussions, because it's his invasion. I think we need to be realistic here. There will be no talks, no significant talks, unless Russia withdraws its forces from territory that it has seized in 2022, that it pulls back in the east and in the south of Ukraine. Here's a scenario that could lead to talks, but it will require, as Noah mentions, the continued support of Ukraine. And that is, Ukraine takes further territory in the east and south this year, that they get almost up to the doorstep of Crimea, which of course Russia seized in 2014. And then at that point, it's, Mr. Putin, do you really want to continue with this? Because you have been defeated. You have not conquered Ukraine. You have not even taken those territories that you declared that you annexed last September. And it's exactly what Ukraine said last spring, going all the way back last spring, which is they proposed to the Russians at that point, 15-page document. Look, we want to discuss the future of eastern Ukraine after your forces go, and we want to discuss the future of Crimea and let the people of Crimea choose their way forward. And that will take time. That's still on the table. But as long as Putin is dedicated to the idea that he can still defeat Kyiv, and we saw him on display in Moscow saying this just this week, then no, we're not going to have negotiations with a guy who basically it's win or bust.
Noah, let's get the latest on strikes, shall we? Only because just this week we had nurses calling off strikes. That's nurses in England and Wales calling off strikes, which was going to be just one of the most impactful strikes from nurses. Actually, they were involving more nurses such as those from A&E, critical care units. They've called that off to sit down with the government for talks on the pay rise that they're looking for. No sooner had they done that, we got news from junior doctors, 3 days of strike action in March.
Yeah, the reality here is, I think, is that we should all be preparing for A&E realistically having to close, or many A&Es having to close. So just everybody be extra careful, I guess, during that 3 days, because the junior doctors are willing at this point to put your health, your life potentially above their paid ones. So the reality here is that the junior doctors see about 80% of people that go into A&E. That's the estimated number. That's a lot. And if the junior doctors all disappear and the consultants all try and come in, the BMA have said that they should be asking for £158 an hour during weekdays and £208, I think it is, on an hour on weekends, which is an astronomical amount. These are the kinds of money that we're talking about here. And if you're having to fill in 80% of an A&E, it's going to shut realistically. So this is a point, I think, a real inflection point where the BMA have to be very, very careful that they don't completely lose all public sympathy, especially when you're talking about massive numbers. I've seen 25% and 35% pay rises kind of touted about. They need to be really, really careful that the public don't just turn on them and go, you are genuinely putting my life at risk here, quite actively, by choosing to go on strike and suggest that consultants are paid such astronomical amounts to come and back. So that's the reality here. It's a really, really, really dangerous moment for both the government and for the BMA in the battle for public opinion.
Scott, do you agree with Noah? Do you think junior doctors are putting people's lives at risk with this strike?
I think the reality here, Claudia-Liza, is that if you don't fund your National Health Service, if you don't provide suitable working conditions, and you put everybody's lives at risk on a day-to-day basis. We've seen this in terms of the working conditions that nurses are having to face. We've seen it in terms of the working conditions that junior doctors are having to face. There will be arrangements made on these days of strikes to triage. The most serious cases will continue to be seen. Those cases that come to A&E that are not as serious will be delayed or will not be seen for those few days. But the fact is, it comes back to this. The government needs to negotiate. If it wants a decent National Health Service, it needs to negotiate on a basis which provides not just a level of pay, which means that people, get into the profession, want to stay in the profession, but need to provide the working conditions, that you don't just simply break them. Junior doctors work an incredibly long amount of hours. They do so at relatively low pay compared to some other fields. So now, the government can't hide on this by saying they're risking your lives, they're going to kill you, when it's a day-to-day issue that the government needs to engage with.
Okay.
I just think the government, it's facing the reality. It doesn't think it has the money to actually sit down and negotiate.
Okay, Professor Scott Lucas and Noah Khogali, good talking to you, going through some of the main headlines.